Okay, so let's start. Thank you so much, Peggy Levitt, professor at Wesley College, to be part of this session, which is the inaugural session of the webinar, The Fields of the Global. We are very much, we are very pleased to have you today give this inaugural talk. We would have loved to have you in Paris today. Today is the Fête de la Musique, so it's a music festival all over the streets. Wow. And it's something very special. And okay, we are in a pandemic time, but the Fête de la Musique is something very special. It would have been lovely to have you today. So maybe next time we can have you. Okay. Yes, I think we have so many things in common between your global dissenter and what we are trying to do with the GRIP, Global Research Institute in Paris. And yes, this is a good opportunity to discuss maybe further collaborations. Great. So I leave you the floor for 45 minutes and we'll discuss after.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Sylvie and Vincenzo and Isabel, very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time of year and everyone is, I guess, zoomed out is a good way to say this. So I'm just going to jump in. When prospective students visit Wellesley College, which is the small liberal arts college in suburban Massachusetts where I teach, they feel as if they've walked into a real life version of their perfect college dream. The academic quad overlooks a sweeping lawn leading down to a picturesque lake. The 100-plus-year-old buildings that surround it are straight out of central casting for the Ivy League. The oak trees are as old and as wise as the students hope to become. Several years ago, when I got back from sabbatical, our president announced that we were embarking on a strategic planning process. We had committees that formed to talk about governance and community and Wellesley's presence in the world beyond our campus and the liberal arts. Should the liberal arts be organized in the same old way and include the same content? How could we ensure that Wellesley could survive and thrive well beyond when we all retired? 6 months later, the coronavirus and anti-racism struggles across the country thrust us into uncharted territory. In addition to adjusting to teaching online, our students called us out on the carpet for the persistent structural racism that pervades our campus, despite our best efforts to address it. They called for more faculty of color and for a more diverse curriculum. They demanded that race be one of the central axes of our conversations, whether they were about economics or sociology or politics. We're not alone. Across the United States and the world, calls for greater equity in the halls of the Academy, the Museum Gallery, and the Publishing House are loud and clear. They demand more diversity and inclusion, or that the university should be globalized or decolonized. Why then, if everyone agrees that business as usual is no longer acceptable and that a wider range of voices need to be heard, is progress so slow? How is it that progressive institutions which were created to be the solution are now part of the problem? The simple answer is actually quite complicated. The white Western privilege that underlies the lack of diversity in our university curriculum is the product of a supply chain of exclusions that leave out a broader set of experiences at every turn. These begin when a toddler on one side of the world is surrounded by art supplies, while a toddler on the other is left empty-handed. They continue when one writer's work gets translated and circulates internationally, while the others is read only by people back home. And they extend through the structures of the cultural and academic worlds to the halls of textbook publishing and academic journal publishing, bringing more African-American thinkers into our curriculum, while an important first step stops far short of addressing these deep-seated cultural and intellectual stacking of the deck. Changing what happens to the university classroom, therefore, can't happen with changing how the knowledge that gets taught there is produced. The story of inequality in the classroom is the story of inequality in the museum and the bookstore. The institutional supply chain that connects them, or what I like to call the inequality pipeline, places barriers to entry for artists, writers, and thinkers who live outside the traditional centers of cultural and intellectual power at every step of the way. It's only when institutional interests converge that ideas and culture from outside the West flow more easily to it. But that flow is inherently limited. As soon as it's strong enough to fundamentally challenge business as usual, the gates close. The university, no matter how decolonized or diverse it claims to be, becomes part of the problem rather than the solution, changing the system only so much that it stays in place. My current book project, on which this talk is based, maps that pipeline and how interests converge and diverge to allow and control what circulates through it. It tells the story of how artists and writers from Argentina, Lebanon, and South Korea negotiate their journey through the global art and literary worlds, and how and when they make it to the classroom. It's the story of producers and consumers. And by that, I mean it's not just the creators of art in culturally peripheral countries who face difficulties. It's also those of us who want to read and look at their work that have to struggle to find it. I am by no means, of course, the first to critique the global academic and cultural worlds. In fact, I build on the work of many incisive thinkers. For me, however, their analysis often comes up short in several fundamental ways. First, they don't have a clear enough vision of how the institutions produce and reproduce intellectual and cultural inequality, or how one piece of the inequality pipeline produces inequities down the road. Second, they're often based on the idea that solving national, cultural, and intellectual inequalities will do the trick. But the lack of representations of artists and writers of color in US and European universities is part and parcel of the enduring colonialism that prevents writers and artists from culturally peripheral countries from ever getting recognized to begin with. So that means that showcasing more Latinx culture, which is an important step forward, stops far short because it doesn't connect the Latinx experience inside the US with the Latin American experience outside it. The enduring legacy of colonialism and imperialism in the region, which drove migration to begin with, persists in the global cultural pecking order that keeps Latin America in its place. Finally, and most importantly for me, many of these scholars do not suggest a way forward. They emphasize intellect and leave out affect. It's easy to critique and really difficult to imagine and implement realistic solutions. There is, however, a growing impatience with constant deconstructing without reconstructing that I share, a deep fatigue with no but, and a yearning for yes and. So in addition to mapping the inequality pipeline and its enduring hold on universities and libraries and museums everywhere, we also need to profile ways that people are challenging them and charting new and innovative paths forward. I think you'll know the feeling when I talk about that when you're starting to work on something and you look for it in one place, you find it in one place, you start to see it everywhere. Ever since I started working on this book, I began to see articles about the lack of diversity in the publishing industry and in the museum sector every place I turned. One in particular stood out. Richard Jean So and Gus Warasek compiled a list of all the English language fiction books published between 1950 and 2018 that they classified as widely read, which meant that they were in at least 10 library collections and that they were published by some of the most prolific publishing houses. Their database included 8,000 books written by about 4,000 authors, of whom they could identify the race and ethnicity of 3,400. We guessed that most of the authors would be white, but we were shocked by the extent of the inequality once we analyzed the data they wrote. Of the 7,124 books for which we identified the author's race, 95% were written by white people. While non-Hispanic whites made up about 60% of the US population, in 2018, they wrote 89% of the books in the sample. This has to do, so and Warasek said, with who works in the publishing industry. The people in charge of the largest publishing houses are white, So are 85% of the people who acquire and edit books, according to a 2019 survey. There are, and here I'm quoting, there are correlation between the number of people of color who work in publishing and the number of books that are published by authors of color, said Tracy Sherrard, the editorial director of Amistad, an imprint of HarperCollins that is focused on Black literature. And that's just about books published in the United States and written in English. It's hard to imagine just how hard it is for authors who don't write in English to have their words see the light of day. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, translations make up only 3% of all publications. Fiction accounts for only 1% of that number. Writers lucky enough to get translated tend to be already established authors. French is the language most often translated into English, followed by German. The only Asian language on this top 10 list is Japanese. That means that Americans' literary tastes remain parochial and that the taste of the English-speaking world disproportionately influences what ends up on the world's night tables. Likewise, few books written in non-Western languages have ever won the Nobel Prize. Between 1901 to 2017, 29 Nobel laureates wrote in English, 14 in French, 13 in German, and 11 in Spanish, compared to 2 in Chinese, 1 in Bengali, 1 in Russian, and 1 in Arabic. It's not that Arabic, Russian, Chinese, or Bengali speaking novelists are not as talented as their English or French speaking contemporaries. It's that the economics and politics of the global publishing industry work against them. The same can be said about the art world. During the last 40 years, new art markets have emerged and old ones have been transformed. According to the 2012 annual report of the European Arts Foundation, the art market grew by 757% between 1991 and 2012. That same year, the estimated worth of the market for art and antiques was 47.4 billion euros. Data on art auctions from websites like artprice.com revealed that in 2012, 11 of the 25 top-selling artists were from China, reflecting China's growing wealth and interest in patron-funding museums. Artists from India, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey also gained greater prominence. Therefore, the global art scene includes more people from more places who are increasingly connected to one another. Nevertheless, using measures such as financial and critical rankings, sociologist Alain Kemen concludes that the most famous artists still come from the West, with Germany, the UK, and the US making up the largest share. European and US artists like Jeff Koons, Gerhard Richter, and Jean-Michel Basquiat feature prominently, as do a few predictable non-Western superstars like Ai Weiwei or Ilan Tansui. Again, the global art market is still predominated by artists in the global North, and the numbers of artists from Asia, Africa, and Latin America that manage to break through are a small, predictable group. In fact, a recent study of diversity at 18 major museums in the US found that 85% of artists and collections are white, 87% are men, 89% are from either Europe or North America. Museums are scurrying to catch up by creating positions for diversity and inclusion. I'm not sure how much this is happening in France, but here it's quite a trend. And these are aimed not only at changing what gets put on the wall, but also who comes inside to see it. But of course, it remains to be seen how effective these initiatives will be. So what can we say about how this affects the teaching of art history and world literature? I'll start with a view from the United States before turning to my research on South Korea and Lebanon and Argentina. Art historians have been hard at work trying to globalize their discipline for some time now. For over a quarter of a century, they've bemoaned how their discipline excludes women, minorities, and non-Western artists, along with new forms of thought, such as feminism, multiculturalism, and post-colonial theory. Art historians James Elkins, for example, warned that to change the canon, the field would need to rewrite the story of art. It would not be enough to tell more local stories instead of the currently broad, sweeping ones if the stories were, and here I'm quoting again, less beholden to what used to be called dead white males. In response, many art history departments are hard at work revising their curricula, including the larger-than-life art history survey, which in many cases is the only introduction to art history many US college students ever receive. I don't know what this is like in France, but this is like art history 101 that might be your only exposure to art history, and there are usually hundreds of students in these classes at large public universities at one time. Their current efforts to change the survey are particularly fraught as the humanities tries to justify itself to consumers who are increasingly question the benefits of liberal arts education, especially at high-priced private universities. It's not enough, critics claim, to tell a neat, simplistic, chronological story which students would simply memorize and parrot back. Complexity, critical thinking, and interdisciplinarity are sorely lacking. It's not just a matter of including or excluding, but of broadening what we see and understand as the global and the art historical and what has been considered Western and non-Western. But research suggests that little has changed. In their study of 91 institutions of higher education in the United States, Chiem and Colburn found that the discipline has yet to grapple with the pedagogical implications of building a world art history from the ground up. Their analysis of department mission statements revealed that most schools simply add non-Western content and stir without really considering the ideologies underlying these curricular choices. The fact that they continue to use categories like non-Western attests to the fact that old binaries and exclusions still reign supreme. My colleague Kelly Rutherford and I decided to do our own analysis, and what we found is in part what prompted me to take up this book project that I'm sharing with you today. We analyzed various editions of 3 principal texts used to teach the introductory art histories survey at universities in the US to get a sense of if and how the pedagogical canon of modern and contemporary art had changed over time. But while art history was defined, but while how art history was defined reflected a more global approach, the incorporation of non-Western artists into the telling of its story was depressingly slow. They represented only 23% of the modern and contemporary arts featured in recent editions. We also found that while the authors generally agreed about the canonical significance of particular Western and contemporary artists, there was little consensus about which non-Western artists would ultimately have staying power. Their inclusion was more a matter of luck or capriciousness, reflecting the flavor of the month or the editor's personal preference. When we conducted a parallel analysis of the principal anthologies used in comparative literature courses throughout the world, we found greater change. There was steady movement away from the West is world paradigm towards the West and the rest to the current global integration paradigm. The modern era volumes of the most widely used Norton, Bedford, and Longman anthologies featured a total of 175 authors. Western and non-Western writers were equally represented in these combined volumes, with approximately 50% of modern writers Western and 50% non-Western. But while these numbers look promising, this canon of world literature is nowhere near proportional to the global population. Europe and North America make up 15% of the world's population, but contribute just over half of the writers who make up the pedagogical canon of world literature. Asia, in contrast, constitutes 60% of the world's population, but contributes only 24% of the world's literature in these collections. And when we explored whether the authors were featured in at least 2 of the texts we examined later found their way into the wider curriculum, our results were not nearly as sanguine. Our analysis of the Open Syllabus Project, some of you might know this, is a collection of over 6 million syllabi, revealed a clear pattern of teaching scores which capture how often a particular author or her work is featured on the syllabus. Both the mean and median teaching scores are considerably higher for Western writers. For the most assigned texts of Western and non-Western authors, the range of teaching scores is similar, 2.5 to 98.2 for Western texts and 0 to 97.1 for non-Western texts. But the median teaching scores for Western texts is substantially higher than the median for non-Western texts, 39 versus 8.9. Only 3 non-Western texts have teaching scores greater than the Western median. Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, and Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. The remaining 24 non-Western texts all have teaching scores less than 25. In contrast, 15 of the 22 Western texts have teaching scores greater than 25. Even when we looked at the non-Western writers featured in all 3 anthologies, who have arguably been the most canonized, the median teaching scores for non-Western writers in the syllabus database reaches only 12.8 for their most assigned texts. Changes in the art history and comparative literature is not just about what is included in the text, but also about the next iteration of the pedagogical canon and how it gets theorized and interpreted. And because these fields increasingly take the world as their subject, that's a very tall order. While art history does this by adding diversity and stirring, or by rewriting history to stress greater global connection and exchange, the shift from comparative literature to world literature reflects a more fundamental reframing of what this discipline is doing and how it gets done. So what are the key takeaways from this last node of the inequality pipeline? So this is what determines what actually gets into the classrooms and textbooks of the next generation. The first is the existence of this powerful platform, that powerful pipeline. When choosing what to include in the modern and contemporary sections of the art history textbook, editors are strongly influenced by the art market, by who has a solo exhibition at a major museum, by who is showing at a prominent gallery, and by whose works are getting reviewed in important newspapers and art journals. Because editors are committed to diversifying the art history story with an adequate gender and geographic balance, there's a great deal of capriciousness and subjectivity in their choices. I want to briefly share what I learned about this while talking with Fred Kleiner, who is currently the sole author of Gardner's History of Art, which is one of the 3 principal texts that I referred to. And I'm quoting him here. "I can make any decision I want on content," he said. "The only constraints on me are when commission fees get out of control. For the 14th edition, one of the new artists I introduced in the contemporary chapter, again, no one told me to do this, I just discovered her and said this would be interesting, was an Aboriginal Australian female artist whose work sort of looks Jackson Pollockish, but is based on local fabrics created by local women. So all in all, an all-in-one artist whose work happens to be high quality, otherwise it wouldn't go in the book, no matter how politically correct it is. So I included her in the book. I wrote her into mainstream art, history of art. For the 15th edition, her people wanted $5,000 to reprint. So I told the staff, tell her handlers that I'm not bluffing, that she can be written into the history of art as easily as she could be written out. We will pay the same fee. They refused and she is out." Kleiner is referring to Emily Kame Kwangorere. He included her work because it is, in his opinion, high quality, beautiful, and combines Western and non-Western techniques and aesthetics. By doing so, he catapulted her, albeit fleetingly, into the center of US art history pedagogy and increased her visibility and marketability, thereby allowing her to demand higher royalties the next time around. The second takeaway from our research is that economic considerations prevail. The textbook industry is about making a profit. Editors' visions are constrained not only by translation and copyright costs, but by how much and what kinds of change instructors are up for. In large public universities, it's often graduate students and untenured professors who teach these classes, and they have little time or incentive to creatively update their teaching. They're overwhelmed with the demands of teaching and with getting through the bureaucratic hurdles needed to make changes. That means that students at small, elite liberal arts colleges and universities are more likely to get a broader view because professors are expected to innovate and they get rewarded for it. They're also more likely to have the time and resources with which to do so. At Wellesley College, for example, we can apply for a yearly fund to update our classes along with special grants encouraging innovative interdisciplinary teaching. But someone teaching in a large class of 200 students is unable to do. This is also a global canon designed for US students. There are not necessarily, as Professor Vibeke Donica, who's one of the members of the Norton Anthology of World Literature editorial team reflected, works that are well received in the countries where they're created, but works chosen with the needs of US students in mind. Making decisions about what qualifies as world literature based on the needs and preferences of US audiences obviously has its danger. Should anthologies and curricular materials canonize writers who are distinctively global in character, or should the pedagogy of world literature revolve more around works that are already canonized in their own countries? Or should anthologies also emphasize works that have been well received and part of the curriculum in their contexts of origin? Otherwise, the editors risk substituting aesthetic criteria for those of other areas of the world they wish to represent, such as selecting works to please Korean American students that are not actually important in Korea. So now let me shift to what we're learning about what happens beyond the United States and Europe. My colleagues Ezekiel Saferstein, Rania Jaber, and Doyun Shin and I began this analysis, and I want to share some of our preliminary findings with you. We explore what is being taught in art history and comparative literature classrooms in the most important universities in our three cases. In addition to asking what globalizing education means in each context, we consider how national history and the history of higher education, including language of instruction and the organization of disciplines, shapes our answers. We're finding that despite a broad commitment to globalizing education and to increase intellectual and academic exchanges, there are important differences in what global education actually means and how it gets implemented on the ground. It's important to note that we needed to distinguish between the artists and writers that are taught as part of the course content and the works by theorists that are introduced with which to analyze and critique their work. This is another layer of inequality. Chen Bar-Itzhak calls the fact that most of the theories used in the field of comparative and world literature are produced in the West as a kind of intellectual captivity. Even those prominent literary theorists in the field who do come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, she writes, are usually members of the American academic system, hence immersed in a certain academic discourse and often have been schooled in English departments or in European languages and their literature and thought. Thus, the epistemologies of world literature, though through which literature is read and understood, still remain very much the same. In fact, according to the Humanities World Report, the internationalization of the human sciences has increased significantly in recent years, as evidenced by the growth of international networks, funding initiatives, research publications, and international rankings. The report, however, stresses the enduring centrality of academies in the United States and Europe, although it stops short of specifying the barriers to entry faced by scholars from outside these regions. What is also evident is that peripheral intellectual production must pass through the centers, whose universities, publishing houses, and journals still hold the keys to success of the academies of the global world. When materials from the global South are included, writes Argentine art historian Andrea Junta, it's a novelty, rarity, or exception that often reproduces the unequal power dynamics with the center. For the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on our findings about teaching literature here. We find that in Argentina, literature courses are more likely to feature national and regional authors in 31 and 39% respectively, along with 24% of authors from the US and Europe. In Lebanon, 9% of the authors are taught are Lebanese, 39% are from neighboring region, and 36% come from US and Europe. And in Korea, 18% are national, 32% are regional, and 41% are from the US and Europe. We found that there were very few authors from other parts of the world that are featured. The highest rates were writers from Africa and Latin America and Lebanon, which only accounted for 6% respectively of the materials on the syllabus. When it comes to theorists, our findings are even more striking. 51% of the theories taught in Argentina are by US and European authors, which rises to 69% in Korea and reaches 71% in Lebanon. Not surprisingly, it's the same group of theorists from peripheral countries that feature prominently in all three of our cases. I bet you could guess who I'm going to say. The most widely cited are Edward Said, followed by Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Frantz Fanon. All of these thinkers received part of their training outside their countries of origin and are published by large, prestigious publishing houses such as Penguin Random House and Planeta. I don't have time to go into much more detail about what explains these findings. What I will say is that what the work of globalizing education is meant to do and whose interests it serves differs significantly across our cases. I think it's really important to ask, what is globalization actually, what does globalizing education actually mean in each of the countries we're interested in? In Korea, it's part of a government mandated strategy to internationalize the higher education, internationalize higher education as part of Korea's drive to become a more prominent economic and geopolitical player on the world stage. At least among some decision makers, there's little concern about decolonizing the curriculum. The distribution of materials in Argentina reflects what literature scholar Mariano Siskine calls the country's parochial cosmopolitanism. There are more national materials featured here because of the country's strong history of intellectual and cultural pride, which until recently also unabashedly celebrated its European origins. There's a strong focus on the cultural production of the region, which reflects the power of the widely recognized aesthetic and geographical label Latin American literature. In Lebanon, there's simply a paucity of scholarship written by national authors about contemporary national literature and art. The good news is that this is changing as a new generation of scholars takes up the cause. So let me return to the big picture questions I posed at the outset. I could have organized this talk around any node of the inequality pipeline. In other words, I could have discussed how weak the infrastructure and unsettled typography of the literary and artistic fields in Argentina, Lebanon, and South Korea impede the circulation and recognition of most artists and writers. Those who do circulate outside the linguistic and cultural region have usually migrated to study and work, and therefore their social networks include people and institutions close to the center of power. I could have told you about the role of the cultural armature of cities, how history, demography, and longstanding values about who the residents of a city think they are influence the number of resources dedicated to cultural production and what kind. I could have talked to you about the importance of national and urban cultural policy and how South Korea is way ahead of the game because the government supports the production and export of culture as a way to gain a more prominent geopolitical place. I'm happy to say more about any of these things and other parts of my research during our discussion. But let's return to where we began, how to address cultural and intellectual inequality, and what kinds of new institutional arrangements we would want to create to remediate them. As I said earlier, too much of our scholarly conversation involves deconstruction and not enough reconstruction, or charting new, potentially positive ways forward. And this is a challenge, I think, with many parts. As we begin to produce different kinds of knowledges, they're still being organized and disseminated into old boxes. They still have to fit into the established sections of the textbook, the library, or the bookstore. They still need to fit within the structures of the curriculum, the discipline, or the university. But the desperately needed knowledge at the intersection often has no place to go or falls through the cracks. Young scholars who want to produce it run the risk of sidetracking their careers because they will not perform according to the established recognizable metrics or incentive structures. At the very least, we need to train students to recognize the power of these curatorial choices, how what they see and value when they go into a museum or a library or an archive results from a set of choices made by human beings with interests and preferences about how the space is organized or how the categories are structured in relation to each other. But what we really need is new categories, disciplines and textbooks that accept and acknowledge the complicated messiness of the human experience and recognize from the outset how trying to make it neat and orderly can diminish our understanding of social life. Remaking categories means remaking the institutions that create them. That is the hardest but most important question of all. I'm convinced that universities should be organized differently, but everything is stacked against that. The vested interests behind the current organization of knowledge production mitigate against easy change. The journals that we publish in, the foundations that fund our research, and the prizes that recognize our accomplishments are all based on the old categories. Few people are brave or humble enough to start a conversation with a new fan club when they are already so famous and comfortable in the one to which they currently belong. So we must reconstruct as well as deconstruct. We must convene conversations between scientists and social scientists and humanists. We must create international networks that go beyond Europe and the United States. We want high impact journals to not just be written in English and to be available to everyone. But although I'm arguing to a shift away from a no but to a yes and perspective, it's in other words, I want to stress how much one's ability to do so depends upon the politics of where you are working from and the stage you're at in your professional and personal life. So this is not easy at all. And then it's particularly hard for people who are just starting out in their careers. And I think we need to think about who needs to take up the call depending upon their ability to do so based on their social and geographic status. For the last 5 years, I've been working to build something called the Global D Center, a network of academics across the disciplines, art makers of all kinds, so that by that we mean artists and writers and musicians, art managers of all kinds, including gallerists and publishers, and activists who use art in their practice. Our goal is to find ways to produce, disseminate, teach about, and act upon knowledge in more inclusive ways. I've had the great pleasure and honor to work closely with Professor Claudio Pinheiro, an historian and anthropologist at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Through our work together developing and teaching a class on global social theory to graduate and undergraduate students from the United States and Brazil, and in building the Global D Center, we've formulated our own response to these challenges. I have to admit it's idealistic and aspirational and a work in progress that changes as we learn from our students and colleagues across the globe. Realizing this vision would require an almost complete transformation of the world academic and knowledge production systems as we know them. Still, we believe that achieving significant structural and ideological change begins with big dreams. Again, what we propose is not new. In fact, we build openly and gratefully on the shoulders of inclusive thinkers who drove forward prior intellectual and political developments. Their work has sometimes figured prominently in shaping educational reform, but has often been ignored and in some cases intentionally obliterated. We call this call to arms a Southern attitude. This is a term that Claudio coined and that we have been elaborating upon together with other colleagues. It's an attitudinal shift that applies to all stages of knowledge production, a holistic approach to trying to create and disseminate and teach about and act upon knowledge based on a clear set of values, commitments, and actions. This attitude requires unlearning many old assumptions and ways of engaging with our students, colleagues, and research subjects. and disrupting the inequality pipeline. It requires a constant awareness and mindfulness. That is, I'm not sure how many of you in the audience are meditators or know about meditation, but meditators are constantly being told to return to the breath. So we as teachers and researchers must regularly ask ourselves if we're seeing and listening respectfully and without prior assumptions that get in our way. Teaching and learning are at the center of our initiative. That's not just because we're obligated to teach as part of our job contracts. Rather, it's because we believe that classrooms are major sites of knowledge production, and that as such, they have the potential to be major sites of social transformation. We also believe that efforts to decolonize the curriculum and university structures will always fall short if they don't go hand in hand with a change in ethos and attitude, a fundamental recalibration of the relationship between teacher and learner or researcher and subject, and a resocialization into an ethos of collaboration and respect. In our view, most of the post-colonial responses to inequality in the academy have focused on regaining control over theory and epistemology. They denounce the idea that ideas produced in the North automatically help us analyze life in the South. This placed the heuristics of the social sciences at the center of disputes over existing power structures. Theory and epistemology as synonyms for power became the trenches where political and disciplinary contestations between Southern and Northern academies played out, even if both camps understood the theories they were at odds at very differently. Other efforts focused on the university itself as the key node of the inequality pipeline in need of fixing. These scholars argued that we must reorganize disciplines and the administrative structures within which they operate, creating communities of learning around themes or problems, rearranging physical spaces to foster conversations, creating new platforms that allowed a greater variety of voices to be heard, and challenging established metrics of productivity and impact are just some of the positive developments which came out of these efforts. Fighting inequality through theory and epistemology or by restructuring academic life are essential steps forward, but they don't go far enough. Universities around the world still struggle to achieve greater diversity among their faculty and students. When they do, it's often in response to financial concerns rather than ethical principles. Philanthropic and scientific research funding still prioritizes a particular set of questions and demands that the answers produced are articulated in a specific, recognizable way. So this invitation to adopt a Southern attitude is by no means just an invitation to colleagues in the global South. True, many of the ideas and ideologies we build upon developed in response to the marginalization and anger felt by thinkers from these regions. The road forward, however, is open to everyone. So where exactly do we hope that this takes us? First and foremost, a Southern attitude is a commitment to critically engage with and counteract the white male Christian centrism that categorizes the hegemonic Northern academy. It's an unerring dedication to ameliorating cultural and intellectual inequality by broadening the ways we ask questions, the theories we use to answer them, our methods, and what constitutes a satisfactory analysis. It's a search for new structures for organizing and disseminating knowledge production that encourage greater creativity and inclusion. But it doesn't stop there. A Southern attitude is an ethos. It means coming to the table without prior assumptions about what will be said or who will say it, and listening with respect and empathy. It means translating those insights into action, be it small shifts in the micropolitics of our classrooms to participating in global social movements. Challenging theory or making the canon more diverse is not enough if it's not accompanied by a willingness to be challenged, criticized, and to learn from all kinds of people in all kinds of informal and formal learning spaces. Nor is it enough if it doesn't translate into action, large and small, outside the classroom. Likewise, decolonizing, globalizing, and/or diversifying universities is not just a question of reforming institutions, it's a question of transforming the individuals that inhabit them. Without a Southern attitude and the commitment that accompanies it to act, we can change structures and content all we want, but we'll still make many of the same mistakes. How to create a space of teaching and learning that welcomes all races, religions, and gender identities is a work in progress. That is as it should be. Just as we think we've gotten it right, things change in ways that demand a new response. We know, for example, that when we ask a question in one part of the world, we're likely to see something that we don't see if we ask it somewhere else. We also know that what qualifies as theory in a particular context and what work it's expected to do differs. We worry about what is gained and what is lost when most of the conceptual tools being used are imported. We understand that what it actually means to decolonize or globalize the university and who's calling for it is actually quite different across the globe. Recognizing these disparities will be meaningless if we don't address them with greater self-awareness. That means constantly checking in with ourselves about how our position affects what we consider to be useful ideas and frameworks and who is allowed to produce them. To be willing to look with clear eyes at what it means to be on the wrong side of the default categories, whatever they may be. A central goal which follows then is to redefine the relationship between teacher and learner. Professors are used to being the experts in the room. Because graduate students are taught to strut their intellectual stuff and discouraged from admitting what they don't know, this is an unfamiliar, uncomfortable position. This discomfort prevents us from having truly interdisciplinary conversations. How many of you have been around the conference room table and the conversation reverts to something like, well, in my discipline, we do this. Such a response stops the exchange in its tracks and its implicit refusal to do the bridge building needed to achieve mutual understanding. Adopting a Southern attitude means abandoning the expectation that one person can know everything and also or should pretend that they do, and being willing to charge into unknown territories. Expertise comes in many forms, and everyone has something to contribute to the collective project of knowledge production. The creme de la creme is not automatically, I didn't put that in here just because I'm speaking to a French-speaking audience. I wrote this before. A refereed ranked journal article or book. It can take any shape that allows learners to share their discoveries. A Southern attitude, therefore, entails a more expansive definition of mastery. Those with a Southern attitude don't stop at critique or complaint. To do that, we draw upon prefigurative politics, the idea that you must imagine the world as we want it before we can put it into place. We can imagine the intellectual and cultural world as well as its political counterpart by constantly asking, what if? What if our starting point was how family, democracy, or development are defined in Accra or Phnom Penh rather than London or New York? What if feminist thought had been integrated more centrally into urban early developments in the social sciences? Would we have better tools for including multiple voices with empathy? What if we encouraged students to admit they don't know or taught them to hold the ambiguity and discomfort of the unknowable? What if the culture of winning in the classroom was replaced by a wider range of criteria for success? A Southern attitude requires deep listening. That means not only stepping up for those of us who tend to be silent around the table or stepping back for those of us who tend to talk too much, but also making a sincere effort to listen to and understand ideas that are not expressed in our own real or metaphorical languages. Across the world, different cultures of expression and explanation characterize debate. Instead of dismissing those that we're unfamiliar with as inferior, too difficult, adopting a Southern attitude means taking responsibility for the bridge building needed to get the main idea. It rejects the assumption that English is the automatic default language and that modes of explanation typically used in English are necessarily superior. Underlying all of this is a more honest and expansive re-envisioning of how knowledge can and should be created, the kinds of packages within which we expect to receive it, and the kinds of knowledge production we reward based on what criteria. For far too long, the image of the cowboy theoretician has been our model. This lone individual invents original theories, which compete with and ultimately supplant those that came before it. He argues and he contests, and I use he here because I believe this is quite gendered. And he teaches his students on purpose to emulate his pointed critique. He does not share his data for fear that someone will steal his ideas. Because he speaks the loudest, longest, and most critically, he gets the biggest prize. He leads by example, socializing his students to do the same because their success reflects on his success. Producing theory gets more attention than fieldwork. Numbers matter more than words, especially big data sets. The consequence of this kind of socialization extends far beyond the inequality in the academy. Competition versus collaboration and individualism versus the collective good also makes toxic business and politics. A Southern attitude, in contrast, recognizes that scholarship is and should be inherently collaborative. At this year's winner of the Nobel Prize in Science, as this year's winners of the Nobel Prize in Science reflected, science is almost always collective, an astonishing and promising admission given that the Nobel Prize is probably the most visible celebration of fabled white individual male scientific genius. Rather than pretending that one single individual crosses the finish line alone, a Southern attitude recognizes and encourages our interdependence. This does not mean shying away from critique, but rather pledging to deliver it in ways that inspire and empower rather than shame and undermine. In music, writes Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipschitz, that to accompany other players entails more than simply adding new sounds to the mix. Accompaniment requires attention, communication, and cooperation. It means augmenting, accenting, and countering one musical voice with another. At its best moments, that is what intellectual life should be. Such a shift propels forward a shift in what we expect scholarly production to do. We now operate in a world of may the best theory win. A Southern attitude gives up that wrong-headed idea that a single theory or method can explain everything. It embraces a second form of collaboration, that between different theories which supplement and complement each other. The goal is not to arrive at one paradigm or master narrative, but to find ways to hold these different theoretical accounts and approaches in productive conversation with one another. It celebrates the productive tension between possible coexistence and potential cross-fertilization among different theoretical frames. The best theory also does not win because producing theory is not nearly enough. A Southern attitude involves bringing theory into action, a clear through line between what happens inside the classroom or research site to what happens outside it. If we don't connect learning to social activism, then we failed. So at the end of the day, a Southern attitude entails redefining success. That means not only decentering the traditional centers of power and creating new, more plentiful ones, so there are more opportunities for everyone. What we are calling for, that in its best, most generative, sparkling iterations, intellectual life is collective. We pretend that it is not, but we do not develop our ideas alone, rarely resulting in something new. In fact, the pressure that we feel to claim newness results in a proliferation of new names for old ideas, and therefore humble. We propose a model of generosity, kindness, and collaboration that celebrates medium-range insights that are understandable to the world beyond the academy and that advance social justice. Put simply, what we produce and teach about should make the world a better place with better people in it by upending long-standing hierarchies that still leave so many knowledge producers and products out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Thank you very much for a very powerful talk. Maybe I give the floor to Vincenzo first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Peggy, first of all, and without any sycophancy, let me thank you again for your meaningful keynote address that opens in a remarkable way our cycle of seminar devoted to the fields of the global. This is the ambition of these seminars. And I would like, on behalf of the Global Research Institute of Paris, just underline how your global decenter and our institute GRIP were made to make an encounter. I would like just quote a sentence stemmed from your manifesto. And this sentence echoes our own stance and specificity among many other institutes dealing with the issues of globalization. I quote you: "We pledge to reconstruct as well as deconstruct. From our perspective, too many interventions stop at critique without charting a constructive way forward. Thus, we strive to leave behind no but and embrace an yes and perspective. This is exactly what GRIP is trying to do, especially by our commitment to put the analysis of globalization at the test of a pluriverse or multi-directional globalization. Um, to put in a nutshell, for us, globalization cannot be understood without a decentered perspective that lays on the dialectic of the exchanges between the global north and the global south, and vice versa, of course. This is the first reason of our encounter, a possible collaboration based on our common humanistic, inclusive, and empowering, maybe, understanding of globalization. This is not all, of course. This encounter is fruitful for me, above all because your work is food for thought for our institute. Of course, it will be vain, it will be arrogant to address in only 10 minutes your contribution to the global studies. And let me just engage with you a short dialogue on the questions you highlighted in your previous and current works. As you know, Roland Robertson defines globalization as the set of processes involving the world becoming a single place with increasing global connectivity and global consciousness. So following this definition and taking the globe as a focus for human activities, I see your work as an attempt to capture the foundations of what you have called culture in motion or world on the move. What makes your research relevant for me is the effort, the attempt to elaborate, forge concepts and methodological tools to capture the parameters, mechanism, logics, and dynamics of circulation by exploring two main avenues. On one hand, the analysis of connections and transnational lives. You made this in several works, especially in your book, The Transnational Villagers, published in 20 years ago, and that got more than 3,800 citations, according to Google Scholars. On the other hand, you put forward the analysis of fields and scales, centers, peripheries, in the case of cultural materials, as you made in a more recent and acclaimed book, Artifact Allegiance, published in 2015. Your analysis of globalization is always founded on solid empirical and lasting fieldworks. Skillful ethnographies has always been praised by your readers and the authors of a large amount of reviews in several important academic journals. In addition, I think this is maybe one of the reasons of the success story of your publication. It is rare to find books that deal so well with the complexities of social life in the global context, and that yet are so clearly written. I cannot see a trace of the jargon and pontification that I found in so much global social theory. This is fantastic for the reader. Thank you. I would also highlight your great acumen in the heuristic use of scales to observe how the global and the local levels are enmeshed. And also, I think a great awareness related to the paradoxes of globalization that is explored in your works in all its ambiguity and through the lens of the impact of the globalization on the lives of ordinary people. From one book to another, the basic concepts of your approach have been improved, refined, sophisticated, but at the end, the basic tenets are the same. The idea, I can see, the idea of multi-scalar world, the necessity of multi-site ethnographies, and the gaze toward transnational dynamics. Let me confess that one of the sentences that I found in your book, Artifacts, was of great solace, because this sentence helped me to be less stressed with the complexity of multi-sided approach. I quote you: "We also need accounts that are more Fox-like, that do not pretend to capture every detail of the places they describe, but that produce valuable insights precisely because they see the forest and the trees and the patterns that united them." This helped me a lot, because when you compare several sites, it's difficult to understand everything. And of course, we need the scholars like you that have, give a lot of importance to the details, but also to the great picture, to the landscape. But of course, as every one of us, you changed. Globalization may be seen as a big machine to provide people with new opportunities, but there are also several examples that suggest that the opposite is true, and that globalization excludes and makes people feeling marginalized. I feel that even if your understanding of the global world is based on the exploration of the two possibilities, improvement and the opposite, there is a kind of shift in the bifurcation in your research, and that your more recent work is more concerned with the dark side of globalization. If I may. There may be a less confidence in some major accounts of narratives of the globalization that were built in the last decades of the last century. You stated in your manifesto something like this. I quote you: "The fluid 99th global conceptual lexicon to which many of us contributed, including expectation flows, networks, transnationalism, and cosmopolitanism, is out of sync with current realities and much more possible for some racial and economic groups than from others." So I would like that you tell us more about this. What does it mean? What does it mean? Are we facing a new stage of globalization? Or this suggests that in the previous period, we were too optimistic, and that we are facing a kind of fatigue of globalization, just like we are facing a fatigue of democracy, like as Arjuna Padurai once stated. In other words, what are the topics of this new stage of globalization, if there are any? And what should we keep of the previous concepts? Should we be more or less concerned with the flows and more concerned with bifurcations, interruption, because times are becoming very hard? You will tell us. And now, a comment on cosmopolitanism. The topic of cosmopolitanism is at the core of your understanding of globalization, in my view, because it allows you to put forward the quest for inclusiveness that your global dissenter is pursuing. And even for another reason, because the question of the most important question, even today in your talk, is what kind of culture do we need to become global citizens? So cosmopolitanism is at the core of your analysis. But it seems to me, if I may, that you hesitate. Let me explain. On one hand, one can read in your book, Artifact, Elegiacensis, this kind of sentences. I quote you: "In today's global world, cosmopolitanism is a necessity rather than a luxury." Another kind of sentence: "We have no choice but to bet on cosmopolitanism promise." I completely agree with you, of course. And I think even that in your works there are all the ingredients to elaborate an everyday cosmopolitanism that can take the stance of what we can call a dialogic of even conversational cosmopolitanism based on individuals, groups, institutions located in national particular background. I equate your effort to an ethic of pluralization instead of pluralism that allows you to claim a quest for inclusion. There is a theory and praxis of inclusiveness in your work, as inclusiveness is based on the pillars of decentering and sharing, the two pillars. This is inclusiveness. I think that you're right. We need this kind of effort as times are becoming very hard. And we live in an age where counter-enlightenment ideas, movements, projects, political parties are flourishing, especially in Europe, but even in the US, you know this better than me. But on the other hand, you also know how harsh the criticism against cosmopolitanism is in the global literature, especially to one dimension of cosmopolitanism, the dimension of universalism. And this dimension, universalism, is rejected as too ethnocentric, imperialistic. So, okay, there is, you tell us that cosmopolitanism is very important, it's not a luxury. And on the other hand, we also know that cosmopolitanism is rejected because it's too universalistic and too ethnocentric. So my question are, what kind of sorry, it's a lapsus. What kind of cosmopolitanism can be inclusive at a planetary level without any universalism? Can we have cosmopolitanism without universalism? This is one question, the first question. If we agree with the idea that we need universalism, of course, post-colonial, decentered, symmetric, reflexive, whatever, but we need an universalism, do we have an idea of which one could be inclusive enough to lead to a cosmopolis? In other words, my question is, can we have is it possible to have cosmopolitanism without cosmopolitics? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. Maybe Sylvie, do you want to take the floor now, and then we have the discussion with Peggy?
It's up to Peggy. What do you prefer, Peggy, to answer that question or to go back to mine first? It's really up to you.
There's a lot of questions.
Yeah, so maybe it's better if you take the floor now and we continue with other questions, because the question is so big, this one. So
yeah, I'm happy to do whatever you want.
Okay.
I can't pretend to be able to answer all of those great questions. I really appreciate them, and I appreciate the thoughtful reading, Vincenzo, that you brought to my work. Thank you for your kind comments. I am really glad to hear about what you're trying to do together. My own personal experience, because I'm a Spanish speaker, not a French speaker, has been that I know that there are lots of conversations happening in French that are often feel like parallel play to me, and I'm not quite sure how to bridge those gaps. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to start a conversation and figure out how we can do that. I think that my understanding and my goals for doing scholarship about the global are not as lofty and as broad as maybe many of my colleagues are. You quoted from the conclusion of Artifacts and Allegiances, and I appreciate that. I have no idea how many people actually got to the end of that book, but there were very important ideas in there for me, in the conclusion for me. And so one of them was modeling this idea of a different way of doing global scholarship that is not about knowing everything about every place that you're studying, but accepting that it's really wonderful that there are people who study one place in depth for a really long period of time, and we need that kind of scholarship. But we also need people who study enough of several different places so they can see the patterns across these cases. And of course, you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the reason for my argument about collaboration, because you have to do that kind of scholarship with collaborators who will keep you honest and on the right track. But also it needs to be judged on its own terms according to different claims, because it's not claiming to do the same kind of thing. And I think we need more of that kind of scholarship, but that they're not the same, and they should be complementing each other. And so that's part of the argument that I'm making there. I don't find it very productive to get into long philosophical discussions about what does cosmopolitan mean. And I thought a lot about that when I was writing Artifacts and Allegiances. And I came up with two solutions based on my field work. One was to think about a cosmopolitan nationalism continuum, which, the question was, how do museums put the nation and the world on display? And why do they do it in what combinations? And so all of the countries that I studied, which were Sweden and Denmark, the United States, and Singapore and Doha, fell at different places along that continuum. The global was always seen through a national lens, and the national was always in some way related to the global. And so it's as you say, it's dialogic. It's not an either or. It's how do these things combine and why in particular places at particular times. So that's one answer. And then when I would talk with people, curators, about did they think that that's what they were doing with their work, to me, it ended up being an empirical conversation. So it's an empirical question. And when you ask people what cosmopolitanism means, they talked about things like creativity and curiosity and the willingness and ability to participate in a conversation about what cosmopolitan values would mean in a particular setting. So not to assume that common ground looks like this, the universal is this, but to teach, it's a set of skills. It's a willingness and a set of skills to meet somebody who's different than you and have a conversation in which you might really disagree, but you try to figure out what the common ground is. And that really makes a lot of sense to me, because it isn't about a universal a universal agreement that would last for 1 second and then go away based on how geopolitics changes. And so I think about the definition of I think about cosmopolitanism as an empirical question that needs to be defined in a particular place and at a particular time. And, about whether I think the dark side of globalization, I still don't, despite all the moment that we're living through of populism and nationalism and xenophobia, I don't think we're going back to the old days. I believe that the institutions that are in place and the social networks are in place are so deeply rooted at this point and thick and established that, I'm with Doug Massey when he says it doesn't matter if you change the migration laws between the US and Mexico, because those social networks are so long-standing that people are going to have these transnational relationships anyway, and that they don't rely upon movement. And I guess that's a way to smallly answer the question about transnational migration, but I would apply that same logic for global connectivity. What I am arguing for is that I'm not interested in grand theories about this, or that's not my skill set. What I'm interested in is nuancing what that actually looks like describing this inequality pipeline, and you know, what are the nodes? How did the nodes of blockages actually work, so that we have some place where we can actually intervene? And what I'm finding a lot is the importance of region. And what I'm also finding is that there are a lot of people who are not, you know, they are not dreaming of the centers as they currently exist. They are not trying to get to the Venice Biennial. They are trying to create the Sharjah Biennial, which is another circulatory set of infrastructures and platforms that circumvents the ones that are already in place. So yes, I am meeting people that are still, you know, kind of going with the geography, the cultural geography and hierarchy as they already exist. But I am also trying to find and write about cases of alternative interventions and that have different kinds of goals and redefine success, as I kept saying in my talk. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Sylvie?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Levitt, for your very stimulating presentation. If I may, listening to your answer, what's really striking was that you seem to present your work in a very modest way, with focusing and emphasizing on the grounding research and field research. And when I was reading your work, and especially some of the articles I want to present to the audiences, I was really struck by the sharp, very, very sharp theoretical frameworks that you are presenting. So maybe you are a little too modest according to my reading of your work, if I may. So I will concentrate of one point of your beautiful and wonderful work around two of your recent papers, which are explaining variation in scale shifting, the role of spatiality, topography and infrastructure in the global literary field, published in Poetics in 2019. And the second one is becoming a cultural destination of choice, lessons on vernacularization from Beirut and Buenos Aires, published in the International Journal of Cultural Publicity last year. The main concept I want to focus on, because I suppose the audience is maybe not very familiar with it, and it's really, really very powerful. It's the concept of vernacularization that you distinguish from the concepts of globalization, hybridization, crowdization, color dubbing, fiction, and translation that we are probably more used to. This notion is central in your theoretical investigation to articulate the theory of fields, borrowed from Bourdieu, of course, with a multi-scalar approach, which is the main perspective of the decenter that you are part of, and also the main perspective on most scholars in the field of global studies. This vernacularization concept articulates 4 dimensions, and I just want briefly to go back to those 4 dimensions to make clear to everyone what I'm talking about and articulate a question around those dimensions, taking an example. So probably you're going to like the fact that I'm going back to the field then. The first dimension of this concept is what you call positionality. And I'm quoting you again because I want to, it would be a nightmare to paraphrase it. So it's beautifully written. So I want to quote you, and you defined it as the social embeddedness of the actors doing the vernacularizing and where the institution and cities they are working from are located in the global cultural hierarchies. So obviously this definition brings you to discuss the notion of fields, as I previously said, which you specialize, which is something new, because Bourdieu was not very fond of specialization in a way, for interregional comparison purposes by distinguishing what you name the fields topography, and maybe you will be able to go back on this, and the fields infrastructure, which is something we are most used, because it's a vocabulary that was part of Bourdieu's vocabulary, in fact. And you apply this theoretical framework to the literary field to confront Bourdieu's previous analysis in a multiscalar perspective. And what is really interesting is that in this multiscalar perspective, you distinguish the proximate field, the transnational field, and the global, and showing in very detailed way how these are not the same, and these are the relation between those three levels are by no ways automatics or reversible or equal in a way. The second component of the vernacularization that you focus on is communication. And again, I will quote your definition here. You say, communication goes beyond simple transmission and translation to make something comprehensible, appropriate, and useful. And all those words are really important, because communication, according to you, has to be useful. And it goes to another point I will talk about after, what really was interesting for me. It brings you to analyze the roles of agents of the field, if we go back to Bourdieusian terms, so the one that you call professional bookers or institutions such as museum, like in your book, artifacts and ally agencies again. The third level concerns aspiration and goals, in a way representation of the world, the way institution, policies, policy making project something in the world and see the future. And again, I will quote your definition. Just as the contents of the policy assemblage is transformed to fit a local context, so are the goals he hopes to achieve. Vernacularization involves not only transforming the stuff of policy making, but also what is it meant to accomplish. Each step involves meaning making and remaking, whether it be the identity of the vernacularized himself or herself, or the significance of the institution and cities that he or she works from. And the fourth level is focused on the change over time, because as far as you articulate all those different levels, positionality, communication, and institution like brokers again and museum, as well as aspiration and goals, undoubtedly vary over time and not only over space. This brings me to try to consider all that theoretical articulated framework to a very specific topic, current topic, which is the current debate on fine art museum and ethnography museum as vernacularization agents, now that are very much criticized as being colonialists. The debate is quite strong, as you probably know in Europe, a former colonialist continent. Let me give you some examples. The Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, for example, that maybe you've already visited. Have you? Okay, so it's going to be more clear for you what I'm talking about. Dedicated, as you know, to the indigenous arts and culture of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, has been called a Disneyland of exoticism, while its initial aim was precisely to unlearn exoticism in a context of rising populism and xenophobia. In 2018, the publication of the report on the restitution of arts objects stolen during colonization in Africa and displayed in French museum, written by French scholar Bénédicte Savoy and Senegalese scholar Felwine Sarr, that both advocated for vast restitution of works that arrived in France during the colonial era when requested by African states, reopened a debate within the field of curator and specialists about the status of those objects. Were they bought, offered, exchanged, or looted, or stolen? This claim for restitution has already been made by Emmanuel Macron when he was running for presidency, but contrasts strongly with the heritage code that we have in France and its principle of inalienability. It also contrasts with the historical vision of the museum as phrased by Stéphane Martin, who was the director of Musée du Quai Branly. When the report was released, he reacted as such. He said, "It is a cry of hatred against the very concept of museum." He wanted then to underline that museum had to articulate one universalistic approach, maybe renewed, and the respect and preservation of all culture. But is that so simple to do? In this discussion, many components of your theoretical framework 6 seems to be at stake. Positionality, when the balance of power shifts from the West to other regions of the world, and when the former Western-centered universalistic approach is no longer hegemonic in the public debate. Communication, when the voices come not only from institutions or professionals of the cultural field, but also from professionals from other fields like activists, politicians, as well as from the public through the internet, because the public is rising and it has a voice, a strong one. And third stream of questions concern the goals and aspiration regarding the possibility of a shared humanity as presented in a museum, and the debate upon its narrative, which narrative is now possible, and in how to articulate it. Maybe it's a big question, but I try to focus on one field to try to be precise. Many thanks in advance for your answer.
Thank you. Thank you for these great questions and for such a, again, a thoughtful reading of what I've been thinking about. I really appreciate it. I don't have an easy answer to that question. If I did, I'd be the head of the International Committee on Museums. I think we're at a moment where these questions are being asked much, much more seriously than ever before. I think what you're seeing from the museums that come back with, we're universal museums that are safeguarding the patrimony of the world. There are, I think, 25 museums that signed on to some kind of statement about that, which was a kind of a preemptive move when they saw all these requests for repatriation coming. The British Museum or was among them, saying and that's the whole justification for holding on to the Elgin marbles. We're holding the patrimony of the world. We can, many more people can come here to see these things than would be back in Benin, for example. The Benin bronzes have been in the news so much lately. So these are very difficult questions. And one response that I saw a lot in my research for artifacts and allegiances were ethnographic museums that decided to treat the materials as art rather than as material objects made in social places by social beings. And that was another way to circumvent the difficult discussions about who can tell what stories and who should own and how do you share. And I saw interesting experiments with getting community members to come in and talk about how should these objects be treated. But museums are not going to go away, but they're deeply flawed. They're deeply flawed institutions that are deeply invested in doing the same old, just like universities are. And so it's almost like we need a a theory of change for all of these all of these institutions that are deeply invested in the status quo. And the way I framed my talk today was to talk about interest convergence. The idea of interest convergence was implicit in what I said at the beginning of my talk, because it's only when it's within the hegemonic institutions' self-interest to change that they're going to change, but they're only going to do it so much that they're only going to do it enough so that the system stays in place. So if I were the head of the International Committee on Museums, I would look for that sweet spot where you could push institutions to move towards more extensive change, also recognizing that that gate always closes. And I think that's what's happening, as far as I can tell, that's what's happening in different parts of the world, whether it be, the publics in European and US cities, or whether it be in the countries of origin where the materials were produced. And in the United States, and I'd be really curious what you would say about France, the United States, that's getting a lift from the anti-racism movement, in the sense that goals of greater global equity dovetail with goals of greater internal diversity. And sometimes those can lift each other up, and sometimes they end up sort of competing with each other. So now I mentioned the idea of having a diversity, equity, inclusion officer. So many institutions are doing this kind of thing. It's about the same issue. It's just looking more internal diversity for the United States. But if people were less parochial, they would connect the dots between these two discussions, and that could be fruitful. So I don't know if I answered your question, but those are some of my thoughts in relation to your thoughtful comments. So thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vincenzo and Sylvie, for your very interesting comments, and Peggy for all your answers.
Can I ask, are the people who are still on the call part of your center? Or they're?
Yes, some of them.
Okay. Okay. And could you, do you want to tell me a little, I guess I should shut up and let people ask questions, but it would be helpful to me to learn more about sort of what are your dreams for your collective work together?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if Florence or Julien would like to say a word. The connection is not so good for me. I don't know if it's the same for you.
Maybe if the idea of our institute is to be a kind of hub, a hub of hubs. I try to connect global institute working on globalization,
Mm-hmm.
and in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, and even in the United States, because we don't want to exclude the global north, of course, because it's a kind of dialogue. That's why we talked about the dialogic cosmopolitanism. This is one of the idea, and we are strongly supported by our university. As you may know, we belong to the Université de Paris, which is a newly born university, is the diffusion of the ancient university, Paris Descartes Université, Paris 7, to very big universities, and now we are one of the biggest universities in France. So, and we are very supported because for our university, you know, the internationalization of the knowledge and of collaboration is what is at stake. But of course, this is part of the global norms to be more productive and to be, you know, to fit to the global pressure. But for us, this is not the most important. The most important for us, for Isabelle, Florence, Julien, myself, is to take advantage of this opportunity, institutional opportunity, to create a more integrated knowledge on globalization and to give a voice to some centers that are not able to express themselves because they don't have money, because they belong, you know, to the smaller places in the world, and because they don't have the possibility to found research and so on. We are not very rich, but we have some possibility to engage some research. And we have three main topics. The first one is the city, global cities. Mm-hmm. The second one is circulation, and Julien Mallet is the head of this axis of research, the global circulation. And the third one is about science and global risks. So we have these three topics, and we try to pursue research on extensive research on this. Okay. It's quite classic, but and in this vein, we would like to, you know, to start a conversation with the global dissenter.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Maybe I can add a word. Within the group, I am the head of the Federation of Research Centers working in the Global South. Mm-hmm. So in fact, we have 8 research centers linked to IRD. IRD is the Institute of Research for Development. And we are used to work in the Global South and to work with empowering people and research centers around the world. So I was very much interested in the Southern attitude you presented because we are very much interested in social justice, of course, and Southern series also. Mm-hmm. So yes, this is a small adding I wanted to do to Vincenzo. My connection is very bad. I don't know if it's the same for you.
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I think maybe it's time to finish our session. I don't know if somebody wants to add something or to ask a question.
Just to thank you very much for your intervention, and it's really interesting for a question of circulation, and we will discuss it in the research group. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. It was very nice to meet all of you, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah,
thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. You know, Peggy, we can also plan in the near future a more formal meeting and discuss about the real opportunity to try to collaborate.
You understand that the Global Decenter is a guerrilla operation?
I understand.
Okay, so there's no big funding behind this, and partly that's on purpose. In fact, we're having a meeting on Thursday to thank you for coming. To talk about governance and to see how we can keep our agility and flexibility and creativity, but still have enough
Alive.
resources so that people from the global south can join our conversation. So I'll keep you posted on that, but we're also thinking about who gets to make the decision, like how's decentered decision making actually work? So I'll keep you posted on that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a great talk and with great discussion. And I hope we will be able to have you in Paris in the next future, and also to collaborate together. That would be really nice. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
See you, everybody. Thank you.
See you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.